So I'm Simon Quinn. I'm the Executive Director of the High Streets Task Force. This is our fifth of a series of webinars which has been looking at the route map to transformation. I just flag up now that we are going to do a sixth, somewhat unplanned, but which will actually help you to use the route map, and we'll explain some of the tools that we have, but we'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end. So what I wanted to do was to start with the question we asked at the very beginning of this series, which was, could the new normal be a better normal? And I think what we're thinking about this is that we're still seeing the impact of COVID. High street footfall has returned and been pretty steady at about 50% of what it was 12 months ago. We are seeing some differences across different kinds of centres. Holiday towns at this moment are seeing the reduction of only 38 to 40% during the week, as people perhaps take advantage of being on a beach in July. But many of our major cities are seeing lower footfall. So we're not back to normal yet. And what we've been thinking about through this process is not only how we get a change in the longer term, but it's about doing things now in the short term and the medium term that put us on the right path to hit the long term. Oh, it's not me doing it, Tom. Let's just go back. Okay, do I get it back again? So we will move on. Sorry, Tom, I think you've got it. Just move me on one. There's only a few slides. So this is our route map. This was all the various stages of it. If you've not seen it before, don't worry. You can download videos from the earlier ones later on. If we go to the next one, Tom. These are the things we've dealt with already, thinking about restructuring, repositioning, rebranding. But this one is looking at, next slide, Tom, reinventing. And so if we pile up the next slide, we're going to be thinking about the multifunctionality of places, this change away from town centres being just retail destinations. And we're going to be thinking about how you reinvent places through innovation, through activation, but also continuing to drive things forward. So we have some great speakers to look at these aspects of it and what is really happening in our towns. And if we go to the next slide, Tom, this is the panel. We're going to start with James Child from Estates Gazette, Neil McInroy from CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, and then Rachel Fisher, who is both MHCLG and BAYS as the Deputy Director there. So if I hand over, move on to James, Head of Retail and Industrial Research. James, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Good afternoon, everybody. By way of introduction, I'm James Child and I'm Head of Retail and Industrial Research at EG. For those of you who don't know, EG is the leading authority on real estate news data and analysis. You know, we've had skin in the game for over 150 years. I've worked there nearly 10 of those years, moving around in different roles, but my current position has really coincided with the turbulence we've seen, not only in retail, but also on the high streets and in our town centres. And Simon and team have asked me today to present to you some of the findings from a recent report which we've launched called Turning the Tide. And as well as that, hopefully I'll be able to share some insights from what we've seen from a data perspective in recent years to hopefully showcase what I think the core investment strategies are for the creation of these multifunctional hubs, and also how to tie that in with those wider economic, environmental and societal transformations and growth that we so desire. If you have got any questions, then hopefully you can see my email address at the bottom there, or you can contact me via Twitter. The inception of this report is kind of strange, actually. I remember one lunchtime back in January, which seems like an absolute lifetime ago. I was in the office with some colleagues, and we were doing what are you up to this weekend? And I said, well, you know what I'd really like to do is I'd like to go to the seaside. And then my colleague, who is from Romania, he said, that's quite, I think it's quite a peculiar thing that the Brits do. And it made me take stock and take a step back and think, well, actually, we are quite blessed in this country with our, being an island and that, and it is, something that perhaps we take for granted. But you know, anyway, I was going through Google Images and showing places like Blackpool and Brighton and the piers and the donkeys and the seagulls and all of that. You know, and then he, you know, at the end, he's kind of turned around and said, "Oh, well, why don't you, you know, why don't you go anymore then? What's changed? What's happened?" And in that instance, I realised that there's no way I was going to answer that question in one go, and that perhaps we needed to do a deep dive investigation into this. Now, I fully appreciate that, you know, everybody on this webinar, you know, won't have a vested interest in our coastal towns, but many of the lessons that we've learned can easily be translated to, you know, the conversation today about creating successful hubs. Now, a lot of these indicators I'm going to show you won't be unfamiliar to you, or those of you who have taken a data-driven approach to your town centre or your place or your high street. This first slide shows us how seaside towns score higher in terms of levels of deprivation than both the national average, but more interestingly, than their neighbouring towns as well. This comes from our own independent analysis of the frequently released Index of Multiple Deprivation Scores, which are released by the ONS. Some of those indices include things like living and education, and employment and health and crime, as well as skills and training. So socially and economically, you know, the data shows us that they are behind the rest. And you can see there's 75% or over 75% of those towns that we investigated have that, you know, that higher score. So, you know, our analysis really shows us that most of this is actually exacerbated by, you know, some fairly unstable employment markets that you find in these towns by the coast. In the report, we do look back and do a bit of a, you know, a genesis of the Seaside report and look at some of the history to get a real understanding about, you know, purpose of place and where they've come from and where they're at now. The one thing that's striking is when you do look at the current data, that the current workforce continues to rely on those economies that were, you know, previously once booming, that probably shouldn't be the main driver for a 24/7 economy in 2020 and beyond. And because of the nature of most of their economies, which are, you know, obviously chiefly things like tourism, F&B, accommodation, you know, employees who live and, you know, work locally suffer from some, you know, fairly unfavourable circumstances, which include high levels of unemployment, which is driven by, you know, seasonality of work, and also lower jobs density. So there's, you know, it highlights the lack of economic and business diversity in those areas, as well as investment. As a result, 90% of those employees earn less than the national hourly minimum median wage, and you know, that really indicates to us that, you know, that lack of competition is failing to drive up that demand for jobs or pay. And we investigate this a bit further, and we actually found that nationally the number of brand new businesses that have been set up, you know, jumped up 30% in the past 10 years. But that figure is, you know, significantly down in coastal authorities, sitting at around 13%. And that's another big indicator of something that we, you know, most of us here will know, that there is a trend of investment and business operations in the heart of inland big cities, which I'll touch on in a minute. And finally, really on this slide, at a macro level, the national economic return per head, or GVA in the UK, has remained fairly flat since the last recession, but the same can't be said for coastal towns, which have progressively declined and decreased. So seaside towns have already really been at the sharp end, or the sharp edge, of a decade of austerity and cuts. But unfortunately, you know, COVID could set to make it even worse. And this chart sums that up pretty well. This was released by Centre for Towns in their report, The Effects of COVID-19 on Our Towns and Centres, which was very handily and expertly put together whilst we were putting together our own data as well. Do check out that report if you haven't seen it. It's a really good read. But anyway, you can, you know, what it shows us is what sorts of towns in the UK have been most affected by, you know, the effects of the shutdown. 28% of employees in coastal towns work in those sectors that are, you know, most affected, which is a huge amount. You know, it's a massive amount of the people that work in these places. And And again, if you break it down further, 16 of the top 20 towns are by the seaside. And I think Newquay, unfortunately, claims the top spot with around 56% of the workforce, being effectively stranded and not working. So although the lockdown has been eased in recent weeks, and there's been announcements today by the government about the next steps out of lockdown, the legacy of this massive freeze is going to really hammer some of these businesses, and as a result, these towns and these places for some years to come. And this leads on into what's kind of been discussed in a previous slide about that recovery to transformation, and the key theme of today's chat, and the success of post-COVID towns and how investment really drives that. So, with the report, we had a look at commercial real estate investment patterns across the UK, and especially what difference has that made for our coastal towns. There is some good news here. Investments doubled since 2014, up to £1.7 billion. Showing that coastal places are doing their bit to encourage inward investment. Interestingly, again, break it down a further layer, we see that most of that investment has gone into retail and leisure assets, which, if you ask any retail analyst at the minute, is pretty much at odds with national trends. Retail itself is pretty perilously positioned in terms of safe asset class, and a lot of the safe money and safe capitals usually going in high spec office developments, at least before the onset of COVID. But there's also been another trend of investment, which has been local authorities and councils actually buying up stock themselves. So since 2013, perhaps over £7.5 billion has been spent by councils, buying up real estate to either redevelop, reanimate, or to secure their own revenue streams, which is another conversation for another time. But it's happening. And in terms of the amounts that are being spent, we found that by the coast, the average asset sale price was around 18 million quid compared to inland, where it's about 20, 25. But not that the amount invested equates to anything that's specifically measurable, but it does point to that that interesting trade-off between supply and demand, and that's because most seaside towns are without the requisite assets in which to invest in. A lot of the great architecture that remains there doesn't really offer a safe haven for property investors. Looking forward, nationally, investment into real estate does look like it is inflecting upwards. June's been described as being a bit of a turning point off of pretty non-existent start of the year. But again, investment isn't the be all and end all. And I think that the takeaway from this slide is that whilst it isn't the be all and end all, it does indicate that prosperity is there, and in this case, revenue and finance for for that extension of town centre economic growth. So I appreciate that last slide was maybe a little bit corporate, but investment is crucial. There's no two ways about it. Often investment comes across, or perhaps appears, as the cold face of rampant capitalism, but it doesn't really need to be the case at all. Places need investment, and when community leaders work to create visions, often investors have to fund those aspirations, and at the end of the day, the money does have to come from somewhere. And this phrase, I think, is really, really important for today's conversation. That's regeneration, not gentrification. I think on the basis of attracting investment, the money that goes in to an asset or a place must really benefit the community that it serves. So the money that goes in must come out to benefit people that use it. Now, whilst there are some brilliant examples out there of groups that are working to force through CPOs, or offering help to community ownerships, groups like Power to Change, for example. Not all capital needs to come locally, and it can be, be sourced from private ventures. Now, it depends what your town requires. Obviously, there's no point in having a high-end chocolate boutique store if your residents require value. There is value in value, by the way. But listen to your community, find out what they want. And I think, moving on to that last point, I have been asked to talk about investment into places and the benefits of such, but perhaps what might be more important now as we move out of, we try and move out of the crisis, is investment into people. As people are really the glue that hold together communities and towns that we live in. Town centres are the beating heart of your local economy. The last 10 years hasn't been great for many places. Austerity and cuts have really hit towns and high streets pretty hard. A lot of the time, those hit hardest have been some of the most deprived in the area, including some of those seaside towns that I mentioned. Now, the current government manifesto has promised to level up, and that's kind of morphed into building out of this impending recession. And then, recently some talk about Project Speed, which, could be an annihilation of what they've called overbearing red tape and nuke counting. So this can either be viewed as, economic devolution of fiscal responsibility, or, a real unbridled deregulation of the planning system, which, also poses some serious threats about the work that, placemakers like yourselves are doing to, preserve hub dynamics. And one hopes that, a localized planning system is supported by government over the next 5 years and maybe even further. As I think it's, it's localism that's going to really help places thrive. But in the long run, there are hopes that we will begin to see that more even distribution of wealth and opportunity, and that's really going to help our towns. As I said, the UK has fallen behind globally since the last recession on a number of economic indicators. Our productivity output's really poor in terms of output per hour. We never really got back to where we were before 2008. We're lacking in skills in the right areas, which isn't to say, by the way, that people are unskilled or underskilled, which is an awful term, but more that, more people are in roles in which they're either under or overqualified for. And we haven't really adapted properly to that move away from manufacturing into a service-based economy. And I think, investment is in the right place at the right time, can only provide opportunity. And I think that encouragement of, entrepreneurialism, encouraging young people to thrive, giving them opportunities locally, trying to reverse the brain drain, by the way, and retain talent and keep people in your town, make them proud of where they live. This is where, the investment side of the conversation is extremely important, because you can't have, prime workspaces or prime leisure spaces or prime art spaces without that investment. And it's a bit of an old saying, but if you invest in the space, then people and businesses largely do follow. Now, think about creating a niche, creating a brand. You'll know what makes you different from the rest. Become a hub for something that's going to benefit your economy and the people that live there as well. And if we look at some of the success stories in the Seaside report, which we produced, they've all got one thing in common, which is that they're all beside the sea, right? But they've all excelled in different ways. So Newquay, I mentioned them earlier, they've become a water sports capital of the country. Bournemouth have become tech capital. Folkestone went from having its port closed down to open up a massive heritage arts quarter and creating a local booming economy, supporting the people that live there. But there are ways to reinvent, but investment is always going to be the enabler. And I think that one of the there haven't been many good things to come out of the last 6 months or so, but that goodwill from the public and localism is really one of the things that we should all try and bottle and invest in. Town centre managers been trying for years and years to get people to shop local. Now it's happening. And as I said, those national economic indicators aren't brilliant, and it's uncertain how, how bad this next recession is going to be, and what effect that might have on, retail and town centres. But there are ways that town centres can ready themselves, and I think that the best example of this is that that shift in working patterns that we're going to see, whereby less people commute away from their towns to a city going forward. We expect to see an increase in flexible working hubs, an increased and sustained level of home working, and we believe that's it's going to benefit high streets, it's going to benefit town centres in terms of footfall, in terms of discretionary spend. We're actually in the middle of compiling some really good research analysis, looking at directly these impacts and which areas could be set to benefit from this, and perhaps some which unfortunately might lose out, typically those bigger cities. So keep an eye on that as well. That's all from me. Thanks very much for listening. If you have got any questions, then do email me. And if you're after a copy of the report, then best place to find that is on my Twitter page. Or if you can't find it, then do drop me a line. Thanks very much.
James, thank you very much. A slightly sobering insight there. I think identifying that we've not done enough reinventing, but that if we are going to carry on with inventing, we have to think of perhaps new things and new forms of funding. So partially to pick up on that point, I hand over to Neil McInroy, Chief Executive of CLES. Neil. Thank you, Simon, and I'm conscious of time, so I've got 12 minutes, but I'll rattle through, and I'm keeping quite broad brush here, not getting into lots of detail. And I think I'm going to be sobering to start, if I may, Simon, and just to say that we have this idea there's a linear element to this crisis, that we're in a crisis and then we're out of the crisis. I don't see it that way, and I think it's possibly folly to see it that way. We're in a moment of crises, and it's swirling around like a thunderstorm in the hills, and it'll come crashing down. There'll be moments of deeper crisis, and then it'll clear for a while, and then it'll come crashing again. And we're in a public health crisis, but probably not even in the middle of the public health crisis. We've got an economic and social crisis to come, with huge business failure, unemployment, if not some social destitution alongside that, and top of the ongoing climate crisis. So unfortunately, we're in an age of crises, and we need to get away from the idea that we're in a crisis and out of a crisis and we move back to normal. There is no normal. There is a new future to build. And in talking and thinking through this agenda, I think it's worth saying that this is a long agenda. It's been going for years, and there's been false dawns for a number of years. Porous, and we worked 10 years ago with DCLG and the Association of Town and City Management on town resilience. We've had an ongoing downward trend in terms of future of town and high streets, and many false dawns. And it's worth thinking why. Well, I don't think, to be honest, that we've really grappled with the central issue. The central issue here is an economic model, an economic issue. The economy of place has changed, and we need to reimagine the economy of place. I don't think that's been grasped. The high street is the canary in the mine. It's the face of our economy. And the fact that it's failing lies beneath a much deeper story of economic failing across the piece. So the high street is part of a wider economic problem, and it's been going for many years. And unless we change the economic model, we'll not change the issues of the high streets. So I'm taking a very particular economic perspective on all of this. And I think the first thing to say is, in this idea of this crisis, we need to think about a new paradigm, if you like. And what this moment now, it should be mobilizing stuff that we knew before COVID. And in late autumn, or in autumn last year, the Financial Times, that beacon of the economic model of capitalism, said, capitalism time for a reset. I agree. We should all agree with the Financial Times. That is what needs to happen. Capitalism needs a reset. And of course, we've got the ongoing climate crisis, which will affect town centres and coastal town centres for moving forward. There may not be any future for coastal towns as places to live, let alone the high streets. And of course, we've got the ongoing COVID crisis that we're in. So
There's a fundamental reset here. We need to wake up and smell the coffee. There's a fundamental paradigm shift moment. And we're in the midst of it, unfortunately, but great things can happen from that paradigm shift. We need to build a new future for our places, for our people, for our economy. Now, if you think about this mobilization moment, there's some long-standing ideas we need to grasp. These are the four things I think, there's maybe more, but four things that came to my head. First, commercial economy. Well, that's dominated high street, and it can't, because it doesn't work. Yeah, we need to change the balance of economic ownership of our high street. Who owns the high street is the central question. And if it's owned by offshore pension companies with distant shareholders who have no attachment to Weymouth, Dundee or wherever, yeah, well, that ownership model doesn't work. So we need to change the dominance of commercial economy and the ownership model to more social and public ownership. Financial value, our towns and high streets are driven by financial return. Yeah, that is not the only value. We've got equal values, environmental, social, cultural value. We need to, they're equal value, just as important as financial return. So let's measure that and let's plan and steward our high streets accordingly. And then we've got the generic clone town idea, yeah? We've got towns and functions of our towns and entities in our towns that you could just look like anywhere else. The local matters. COVID has told us the local matters. We've all become localists in this as we're locked in our back bedrooms. The local matters. Where we get our goods and services from matters. The provenance of our goods and services. Where does this meat come from? Who's serving me this meat? Where does this apple come from? Who's serving me this apple? Has it had proper health and safety? Are they getting paid a living wage? The local matters more. And we need to have that localization of high street, and also a high street that reflects place, identity and history. We are place people. We are social animals that love places. We want to have the distinctiveness, the hankering for the authentic. We don't want the inauthentic, we want the authentic, the real deal, and the place needs to shine through our high streets. And finally, most importantly, I think, our high streets have been driven by agglomeration economics and wealth extraction. The high street is a place of consumption, but mostly it's a place of return. Property, development, and those people that gain in that return have nothing to do with those local high streets usually. The wealth is extracted off these shores. Yeah. So we need to make sure wealth that is made is recirculated, owned in that place. Yeah, these are all resilient strategies, and they're all what we need to mobilize now, if we want to see a high street. We've done a lot of work on this. I'll not bore you with this recent publication. It's a great publication, but I'll not bore you with the details. But at the center of this is community wealth building. Who owns wealth, who influences it, and who benefits from it? It's a defining feature of our high streets, with economic and social life, two sides of the same coin. And we see what needs to happen. And all you Aldous Huxley fans there, we need to open up new doors of perception. LSD, let's localize, let's socialize, and let's democratize our high street. And we're working in dozens of areas across the UK on this community wealth building agenda, and this publication is a blueprint for how you would not just recover, but how, and linked to your point, Simon, not just recover, but how that foreshadows the deeper reform that's required for our economy and society. There's three things I just want to touch upon very quickly before I finish. Three key tenets, if you like, of this thinking, what needs to happen. Firstly, ownership. Ownership matters. We know what we've done with the Federation of Small Business, that 63 pence of every pound that's spent by a local authority with an SME remains local, but only 40% if it's spent with a large firm. That's because a local firm is more likely to employ local people. A local firm is more likely to have local supply chains. A local firm, if they make a buck, are more likely to reinvest that buck in the local economy themselves. They tend not to live in the Cayman Islands. They tend not to shop weekend shopping trips to New York. They tend not to invest in Dubai. Local firms are local multipliers in the economy, and that's crucially important. Now, if we have a greater density of local firms, cooperatives, community businesses, social enterprises, money is more likely circulated. So simple. Let's not give planning permission to large corporates. Let's not make sure that the high street is owned by large pension companies. Make sure it's owned by us, local people, local communities, as much as it possibly can be. And that means that wealth will recirculate more effectively. The second broad thing is high street futures are basically economic plumbing. Let's think about where the leaks are, and let's think where the reservoirs and bowls and lochs and basins are. In terms of leaks, non-local business are leaks. McDonald's is a leak because its shareholders have got no attachment to Weymouth. Yeah. So the more local you have, the less leaks you have. And of course, things like community banks, things like local banking, things like mutual credit networks are all ways of holding on to some of that wealth, and they're the basins. Community land trusts, different forms of municipal ownership, different forms of social ownership. These are all reservoirs to help to plug the leaks. We need to build that architecture. That is the plumbing we require. And if the plumbing is just one big pipe and one big basin that's somewhere offshore, our high street will die. We need to have tributaries. We need to have a hydrological system that flows through our high streets and recirculates that wealth. And the final thing I think may be important to this agenda is our big anchor institutions in place, our housing providers, our police, our community anchors, our education providers, our local government, our hospitals. These places are extraordinarily important because not only do they have affinity to the place and potentially the high street, they also are not likely to disappear to the Cayman Islands anytime soon. They're inert. There's a sticky capital, if you like. And they also buy, they also employ lots of people. They also buy lots of things, and they also own land and property. We need to harness the power of those anchor organizations and make sure that they are rooted in place and abut or within our high street and our town centres. Finally, I would say that in conclusion, resilience, and this is what we're kind of looking for, but having the ability to respond to economic and social change and be agile in seizing new and emerging opportunities. These crises, this moment of crisis, which is going to go on, needs to make resilience. And part of that is to consider how the commercial economy, the public economy, and the social economy work synergistically together. The high street is not a beacon of commercial consumption. It should be a place, a face of a decent economy with all those elements of the economy fitting together. And finally, if I may just use a quote from Ursula Le Guin, the science fiction writer. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by us, human beings. I think that is what we need to do. We need to use the power of us and build our economies and build our high streets that truly represent the kind of future that we want. An economy that, in a sense, is brought back home to our communities, our people, and our hearts. Thank you very much for listening.
Neil, thank you very much. So we've heard a number of perspectives on how we help high streets to move forward. And now we're going to hear from Rachel Fisher, who's the Deputy Director at MHCLG and Bays, and leads the team who's been thinking about high streets and doing things. Rachel has no slides, so if you want to click in the top right-hand corner of whatever icon you're currently seeing Neil in, you'll find you can see Rachel in full rather than the screen with her name on. Rachel.
Hi, thank you. So yes, I don't have slides, for which apologies. You are stuck with my face. Thank you so much for joining, and also thank you, Neil and James, for those really thought-provoking presentations. That was really, really helpful. And I think we're going to have a pretty interesting conversation when we get to the Q&A about how we reconcile the kind of the sort of, on the one hand, the need to bring in investment and that money is important, and quite a lot of that money is coming from, say, foreign investors, with Neil's localism perspective as well. So I think it's going to be an interesting kind of conversation to try and reconcile that. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's going to be cool. So why does government care about high streets and town centres? Well, it's for all of the reasons that James and Neil have just articulated. I've been working in MHCLG and Bays in the Cities and Local Growth Unit on high streets and town centres for a couple of years. We started out with the Timpson Review in the summer of 2018 to look at, asked Sir John Timpson and others to have a look at what needed to be done to support high streets. There was this really unfortunate conflation of shifting retail patterns to conflating that with the death of the high street, which we would argue has been overdone. And I think what we've seen in COVID and in the current crisis, and I agree with Neil, this is the current crisis, this isn't the only one. What we've seen is that people are rediscovering where they live. They're rediscovering the local. They're thinking again about all of these kind of life choices that they've been making. And it's really interesting because what we've seen is an acceleration of some of the trends that we were already witnessing. So we've seen the massive acceleration of shifting patterns to online shopping, for instance. But we've also seen changing patterns. So things like, will we work in town center offices again? Literally on a very personal level, had this conversation with my husband over lunch because we were both working from my house. And we were trying to work out how many days a week would we ideally want to be going into our offices in kind of the next steps. So we've been thinking in the team at work quite a lot about high streets and town centers, particularly in the context of the immediate crisis, but then also in the context of the longer term. And what we've been thinking about really is what are the kind of key building blocks that we as government can set out. So in part, that's about investment. So you will, I think, all be aware of the £1 billion Future High Streets Fund, which is part of the £3.6 billion Towns Fund. We are also providing information in the form of the High Streets Task Force. Thank you, Simon, for being that source of information. And inspiration in the form of the Great British High Streets Awards, which we have run for the past few years and which has shown just what's actually possible in terms of rejuvenating and relocalizing in many instances your high street. And we've also been thinking through how we support innovation. So one of the ways that we've been doing that is through our Open Doors pilot, which was about kind of opening up, as it says on the tin, it was about opening up vacant high street properties to community groups across the country. And so we kind of still think these four sort of basic building blocks probably hold as a kind of framework for how we think about our work in terms of supporting high streets and town centers. And then we sort of went into overdrive in March as the COVID crisis became immediately apparent and as we entered into lockdown. Our priority was really to try and support businesses and save, as we kept kind of saying, saving lives and saving livelihoods. So as we went into lockdown, it was really about how do we ensure that businesses on high streets and across the country were able to keep going. And so in order to do that, we introduced the lease forfeiture moratorium. We introduced other forms of protection for tenants from kind of aggressive landlords. And we basically said, okay, look, this isn't a rental holiday. And we've always been very clear about that. This is not a rental holiday, but this is giving everybody some breathing space to really think through what the next step is going to be for them, what the business model that they're going to need to go forward is. We also, with really broad support from across the industry, landlords, tenant bodies, the UK Hospitality, BPF, Revo, people I never really expected we would get all together. We published the Commercial Property Code of Practice in June. And that's really about making best practice in terms of negotiations between landlords and tenants to be common practice. And that so far has been helpful. We also did all of the other things that were kind of coming out from government in terms of the COVID bills and the loans and the grants and the business rates and all of these things to try and basically, again, just kind of put a pause and to give people some time to think about what the next phase is going to be. So we're thinking about the next phase. And I think that for us, it's really about how do we ensure that both the kind of like hardware and the software of high streets and town centers is fit for purpose in future. So that's how do we think through planning? How do we think through legislation. We have the 1954 Landlord and Tenant Act, which is basically still governing most of commercial property. It's older than my mother. We should probably have a look. You know, like we're thinking about how do we really incentivize places and support places through the High Streets Task Force, through the Towns Fund, through the work that we're doing more generally, to really think about what is the narrative of your place? What are the assets of your place? What is great? What do you love about this place? And how can you build on that to create a sustainable future? So we think in future, places probably need to think about how do you diversify your offer? How do you really maximize the use of a high street, a town center over time? And I mean through time, not just like over the next 5 years, but I mean like 24 hours a day. What is the use of this place? It seems to me that I'm a planner by background, and it seems to me that we kind of got very fixated on specific uses and specific things that you do in specific places, when in reality, the way that people are living their lives increasingly, and particularly I think this is true during this period that we've all been experiencing, people lead very blended lives and increasingly blended lives. And therefore the places that we build and the incentives that we kind of put forward need to be able to support that. So that means that we really also need to look at, in terms of high streets and town centers, we need to look at housing. Is housing an appropriate thing to bring in to try and drive footfall? Similarly, how do we make sure that this is a place that is accessible to everybody in the community, that this is a community hub, that this is a place where people come and where they feel welcome? And I think that's really important as we are having such a kind of like wider debate about how do we repopulate places? Who is this place for, and how do we live together in it? So I agree completely that this is about kind of multifunctionality. This is about innovation. And from my perspective, it's kind of how do we create the best framework, and how do we provide the support to enable growth to happen in places that will, you know, hopefully surprise us all by how just the cool stuff that will happen. So I actually feel like this is kind of an exciting time, and I'm kind of looking forward, and I'll end there because I'm really interested in the conversation. Thanks.
Rachel, thank you very much. We have a lot of questions, not just for you, but for other people as well. Let me start with a fairly general one for all of you. Someone asks, how can we agree on ways that we measure value creation? Economic, social, environmental, ecological. Is there something that could come from government, or government working with people to look at this? Neil?
or Neil, go ahead.
Absolutely. What measures matters. And on these shores in the United Kingdom, we already have the Welsh of the Future Generations and Wellbeing Act, where they have a range of wellbeing indicators from the 7 Sustainable Development Goals. And that is what is driving the future destiny of Wales across its planning and across all the activities. There's tensions there, but that's a great thing to have. We should have well-being in those wider gamut of values impinged upon our planning process. Treasury Green Book rules, a whole range of resumes and process and systems that the UK government has needs to go through a well-being lens. And until it does, what measures what matters? What measures at the moment is GDP and growth and return on capital investment. And our high streets are knackered unless that's changed. We've got to wake up, smell the coffee, get real, and stop messing around. We're in a crisis and it's ongoing. That's what needs to happen. UK needs, I know Lord Bird in the House of Lords has put through a Future Generation Wellbeing Act. We're trying to get one through the House of, through the Parliament. I think that needs to be speeded up. That needs to happen, and it needs to filter through all the micro level policy that steward our great country, and do it quick.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll try and have a stab at answering the question. What defines value to a place is absolutely going to depend on, each and every town and high street is different. Values in one town will be different to another. There are a myriad reasons for why cultural, economic, different indicators that you can look at. But I think for me, you know, a lot of what Neil said, you know, really rings true to me in terms of creating propositions that work for the people that live in these places, or, you know, I say these places, I mean, it's obviously towns, but the creation of value shouldn't be about how, you know, how much money that something is worth, or how much money can be invested into a place. It's not about the pound signs. It's about the you know, the social capital that you build out of that. And that's a point that I did try and get across. But it's, you know, when you do talk about investment figures, you do end up going down that road of, you know, who's invested X amount into what, and so on and so forth. You know, in the report, we do look at some of the areas that have, you know, received some of the largest sums of money in terms of capital expenditure, and on the whole, you know, those are some of the least deprived. And whether that's obviously because the money's going there because they are less deprived, or whether it's the other way around, is, I mean, I've got my own opinion, but you know, everyone will have their own. And I think that, you know, creating measurable objectives are the only way to do that is to have some kind of localism in planning, and some kind of real town centre plan with a real end goal. What that is should be defined by those local leaders, and then, yeah, I mean, you know, again, both Rachel and Neil touched on well-being. I think that's going to be critical, and I think that the next generation coming through, who, you know, are going to want to be more invested in local areas in their towns, should be taken on that journey. It's very important that they are taken on that journey, because that's where a lot of our best ideas come from. But, you know, an example, again, going back to the report, we looked at, you know, some of the areas that were perhaps most deprived, and some that were least, at least in an economic sense. But, you know, some of those areas like Newquay, for example, you know, were having a pretty bad time with things, and they've, you know, they're slowly turning things around by creating value of something that they've got. So another great example, you know, I've kind of theorized was that, you know, if you're on the sea, I mean, there's got to be a hell of a lot of work you can do with green energy, right? So, you know, try and find a niche and run with it, and you know, create a culture around sustainable well-being and the like, and that, you know, that will go some way to you know, defining value, I think.
James, thanks. Can I better move on, because we've got a few more questions, and did Rachel just want to comment on this? Is she looking at me? No, you're fine. Let's move on to something else. There's a number of questions about making it easier for businesses to start up, the role of markets, perhaps simple leases for SMEs, and perhaps more rounded, the thought that what role can high streets, town centres play in social mobility? This idea of that they are places that offer a good career and life, really. And I think part of that is about creating that opportunity for people to work in centres. So I don't know who wants to kick off on that. So it's, you know, I think it's making it easier, breaking down some of these barriers to entry to business startups, to business support, to perhaps apprenticeships, all these other kinds of things.
I think one of the things that we're trying to do is join up, which sounds like a crazy idea. We're trying to join up with colleagues across government to really understand how we can support places to be more entrepreneurial, to encourage people to start up businesses and all these sorts of things, and really trying to kind of bring together different policy strands from across government, because believe it or not, MHCLG and even BASE does not hold all of the keys to this particular kingdom. So we're having conversations across departments to really understand what you can do to support places in the economic recovery. And I think we have to think about this kind of, well, okay, we don't have to, but the way that I think about this is a kind of series of nested boxes, right? So we've got high streets and town centers, which sit within their kind of wider town context, their city context, and then up to the kind of like functional economic geography, they're kind of like LET level or MCA level, if you will. And we need to think about kind of the through line of how the sort of the money, the power, the accountability, and the levers all sort of work through that. And that's one of the things, and that's what I mean when I talk about how do we create the conditions for economic recovery, but I also within that am very, very conscious of the need to ensure that we're reconciling the economic growth, the productivity challenges, Neil, that you highlighted. How do we reconcile that with the wider questions about well-being and about environmental sustainability? It's a tricky, and those are tricky tensions that can pull in different directions. And I think that's one of the things that we've been thinking quite a lot about. There are different kind of mechanisms and ways of doing that. Sometimes thinking through a place lens is really helpful. So how would you, how do you make it easier for businesses to start up on a high street, right? And start from that level. And then what would be all the different things that you need to kind of get into a line, whether that's business support, skills and training, what are the kind of like wider sort of skills levels across the town? Who are you tapping into? How do you get the kind of seed capital? All of that kind of stuff. And then on the other hand, you can think about it from the other kind of straight line direction of what is a skills policy that supports entrepreneurialism in town centers. And I think from our perspective, we need to be able to kind of get at it from both directions.
That's one of, yes, Neil.
Very quickly, is that there's something we can do straight away, and Whitehall needs to get on it, is that we already have business growth hubs that are, exist through the local enterprise partnerships. They are largely focused on large businesses. They're not focused on the community voluntary sector. They're not focused particularly on the high street. They're not focused on planning. They're not focused on creating the soil conditions to create new economies within our high streets. They need to be repurposed. There's many examples of this across the world of how you've put effective business repurposing or units together. We call them community wealth hubs. They could be called whatever. In Barcelona, they call them social and solidarity economy units. Repurpose your business growth hubs. Go back to Whitehall, Rachel, and if you need any help and advice how to do it, CLES is already willing to help you at any point. We go back and ask the question, can we repurpose the business growth hubs quickly?
All right, thank you for that. We're going to run out of time here, but there's quite a lot of people identifying things that they see as barriers to change. Business rates, obviously, there's quite a lot of comment on. I won't put it to you, Rachel, to answer anything, but of course, this the worries about the planning system, the permitted development, what may then happen. Poor local leadership, both views from people who've approached councils and they're not really had much of a response. Some councils who are saying they've approached businesses and they're not actually willing to work with them. And this building about partnerships and things seems to be there. But one final question just before we move on is really, are there major gaps in the evidence base that we still have to really bring these changes about? So I'll ask each of you to just briefly comment on that before we finish. Neil, you're on mute, sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. That's a tricky one. I think the biggest evidence base that I'm seeing a little bit behind the curve on is that I think we need to imagine what the future business failure rate will be and realistically be quite pessimistic about that. And then I think that we need to imagine where the holes in the sectors will be, not just business failure, but holes in sectors. And we're back to 70s economic planning here. I think we need to actually have state interventionism that actually starts to plug holes within those sectors. Because otherwise, and I've already heard it from some towns already, the danger is if we lose lots of, say, hospitality, it'll be bought up by large, as I said in the presentation, large hospitality corporations, and we'll lose that colour and that flavour. So I think it's very important that we get good evidence of who is going to really fall over and not going to get back up again, and start to plan for that so we can start to rescue them before they fall over. Otherwise, we're going to have a homogenization of our high street, I fear, in terms of the economic functionality.
Thanks. James, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think that, we're in a very peculiar time at the moment where, a lot of energy is rightly so being focused or being lasered in on, the events of the past few months and probably the next few months as well. But once we, hopefully we clear that barrier, so to speak, the problems that were there before aren't aren't going to be any better. They're going to be worse. So I think in terms of, you know, the next stages in trying to identify what issues remain or that might come up, we need to do a proper overview of who owns what and why. Try and figure out if there's a way to, you know, in my experience when I've looked at the town centres, it's often that, you know, it's often very fragmented, and it's not only ideas or town plans, but, you know, should you have areas where, you know, you've got a dedicated retail bit, you've got a dedicated residential bit, you know, do we need to think about that going forward, especially with, you know, as you said, Simon, with the deregulation of planning, which could really, I think, you know, damage a lot of the good work that some people have done. So take a handle on ownership, you know, be ready to fight a battle if you have to with planning, and try and come up with a, you know, a succinct plan that works for people, not just today, but tomorrow and, you know, going forward as well.
Thanks. Rachel, do you want to add one final quick comment?
Quick comment. I think we are also interested in the kind of wider data gaps and kind of trying to identify it. We've been doing quite a lot of work with the task force on kind of understanding what the current conditions are. I think, as I was just sort of like scrolling through the comments, I think one of the big interesting questions now is about behavior change, and it's about how people will actually genuinely respond, not just how we kind of, you know, what will be the revealed preferences of people in terms of returning to shops, returning to work, returning to pubs, returning to all of these, you know, and I think that needs some really hard thinking so that we can actually kind of start to prepare for a multiplicity of different kind of futures, because there isn't going to be one solution for any one place. And the whole point about trying to incentivize places to have kind of greater diversity and inclusivity and flexibility is so that actually you can respond to stuff. Like, the more diverse your base is, the better able you are to kind of withstand any storm. If you think about that, just like from an investment perspective, the more diversified your portfolio, if one stock tanks, the other ones are probably going to be okay, and your overall performance level will remain all right. And I think that's the point for me about kind of like how we support leaders in places, in high streets and localities, to really kind of think through, what are the assets of your place? How do you diversify that? How do you support people? How, you know, and really sort of having the evidence base to be able to say that it is good to have more things.
Thanks, Rachel. We're out of time. Tom, can we move just on to the next slide? This was really our journey that we talked about, starting originally with the crisis to recovery, and then really going from recovery through to transformation. All of these are available online, but if you go on one more, Tom, we wanted to give you a final activity, which is really some things that will be posted adjacent to this webinar information. As you know, we put materials up. Both of the reports you've heard about today from James and from Neil are available from our resources section now, but we've also got a task which you'll also find in resources on completing the diagnostic. Next slide, Tom. We are going to do one more of these. Next Friday at 2 o'clock, we're going to be looking at how you use the route map and what should be done to access the tools that we have in the task force to help you do that. And I think the next slide is the end. Yeah, thanks very much to our speakers. Thanks very much for all of you for joining us through this. We hope it's been useful. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.